Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we begin today's story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a journey into America's hidden past. Now, let's step back in time. Clara's story begins in the Deep South, in the shadow of the Mississippi River, where Natchez rose as one of the wealthiest cities of the antebellum world. To walk its streets in the 1830s was to see power and suffering side by side, though only one side was meant to be visible. Grand mansions sat high on the bluffs, their white columns gleaming in the sun. Carriages passed on dusty roads, filled with planters who believed themselves aristocrats. Cotton was their kingdom, and slaves were the hands that built it, though their names were rarely spoken in polite company. Behind the gardens and beneath the oak trees, in cabins hidden from the proud fronts of the houses, lived the people who kept the wealth alive, men and women bound in chains not always visible, but always heavy. Clara was one of them. She was not born in Natchez. She was brought there, like many others, in a coffle of chained bodies that wound its way from Virginia to Mississippi. She remembered the long march, the sores on her feet, the smell of iron and sweat and blood as the traders pushed them along the dusty roads. She was just a girl then, barely old enough to understand the difference between freedom and bondage, but old enough to know she had lost something that could never be returned. Her mother was torn from her at the auction block, sold to another buyer, and Clara never saw her again. In her memory, her mother's face remained soft and round, with tired eyes that looked at her one last time before being pulled away by rough hands. That memory was Clara's first scar, and it never faded. The plantation where she was placed in Natchez was one of the most prominent in the region. Its owner, Colonel Richard Jameson, liked to present himself as a gentleman of refinement. He was not the richest planter in Natchez, but he wanted to be. His house stood tall and proud, with wide porches, long steps, and rooms filled with imported furniture. To the outside world, he was a man of grace and generosity, but inside his household, he was known for his cruelty. Clara learned quickly that the master's charm was for the streets of Natchez, not for the people who served his table. He believed in discipline as much as he believed in profit, and he had little patience for mistakes. Clara was placed in the house rather than the fields. Some would say she was lucky, but luck was not the word she would have used. House slaves lived under constant watch. They served meals, cleaned parlors, dressed the mistress, and raised the children of the very family that denied them kinship. Every smile had to be forced, every word had to be careful. Clara's young face carried a quiet strength, but her eyes could not always hide her defiance. The mistress of the house, Mrs. Elizabeth Jameson, noticed this, and she never forgot it. From the beginning, Clara was marked. The household was large. There were other enslaved women in the kitchen, Mary, who had been born on the plantation. Old Ruth, who walked with a limp, but still carried pots larger than her arms. And little Josephine, only 12, who was already trained to carry trays of china with the grace of a grown woman. Clara was new among them, but she quickly proved herself skilled and sharp. She could season food well, she could mend clothes with a steady hand, and she could read moods and ability that kept her from punishments more times than she could count. Yet the mistress often scolded her anyway, sometimes for no reason at all, as if Clara's very presence was an offense. Colonel Jameson was different in his treatment. He rarely scolded Clara himself, but his eyes lingered on her too long. The kind of silence that filled the room when he entered was heavy, and Clara grew to dread it. For a young enslaved woman, such attention was a curse. Rumors spread in the quarters of what had happened to other girls when the master's eye fell on them. Some bore children who were neither fully accepted nor fully rejected, children who grew up confused, marked by the contradictions of a world that denied their humanity but could not deny their blood. Clara feared that fate, and in her heart she felt a growing hatred toward the family that trapped her in such peril. Natchez itself was a place of sharp contrasts. On the high bluffs, planters built their mansions, while down at the river landing, known as Natchez under the hill, the world turned darker. It was a place of rough sailors, gambling halls, and cheap taverns, where money from cotton mixed with the desperation of men seeking escape. Clara sometimes overheard talk of it when the white men returned from nights below. They called it wild, dangerous, sinful. But Clara wondered if perhaps, in its chaos, it held more freedom than the perfect order of the plantation. She had no chance to see it herself. Her world was bound to the kitchens and the dining rooms, to the smell of roasted meats and fresh bread, to the endless polishing of silverware she would never use. Life on the plantation followed a rhythm, but it was a rhythm built on suffering. The bell woke them before dawn. The field hands walked out into the mist, their hoes and sacks dragging with them. The house servants lit fires, drew water, and prepared for another day of servitude. Every mistake was met with harshness. The overseer in the fields was known for his whip, and the mistress in the house was known for her sharp tongue and her even sharper hands. Clara learned to endure, but she also learned to watch. She noticed things. She noticed how Colonel Jameson liked his brandy late at night, how Mrs. Jameson took powders for her constant headaches, how the children sneaked sweets before dinner. She noticed which herbs Ruth used to heal a fever, which roots Mary boiled for stomach pains, and which plants Josephine whispered could make a man sick if added to his food diet. It was in these small details that Clara began to build a secret knowledge, a knowledge that belonged not to the master's world, but to her own. The enslaved people shared remedies and whispers passed down from Africa, mixed with what they learned from the land of Mississippi itself. Medicine and poison were not so far apart. Often they were the same plant, given in a different dose. Clara, sharp-eyed and quiet, absorbed it all. The years passed, and with them, Clara's resentment deepened. She had seen too much to feel hope in patience. She had seen Mary's back scarred from a punishment she did not deserve. She had seen little Josephine cry after being struck for spilling tea. She had heard Ruth's stories of children sold away, never to be seen again. And she had felt, more than once, the cold terror of being cornered by Colonel Jameson when no one else was near. Every day was survival, but beneath survival, a flame of anger smoldered. Clara's chance came in the most ordinary of ways. Supper. At the Jameson plantation was a grand affair. Guests often came neighbors, visiting planters, sometimes business partners from New Orleans. The table would be set with the finest china, the candles lit, the food laid out in abundance. Slaves moved silently behind chairs, refilling glasses, serving dishes, clearing plates. To the white guests, it was a picture of Southern grace. To Clara and the others, it was theater performed under threat of punishment. One evening, after a long day of preparations, Clara stood in the kitchen as Ruth stirred a pot of stew. The smell filled the room, rich and savory. But Clara's eyes were not on the stew. They were on a small pouch hidden in the folds of her dress. Inside were herbs she had gathered, ones she had been told could bring not healing, but harm. Her hands trembled as she touched it, but her mind was steady. For weeks she had thought of this moment, weighing the risk, imagining the outcome. She knew what it could mean for her, and she knew it might cost her life. But the thought of continuing, as she had lived, seemed worse than death itself. She remembered her mother's face that day on the auction block. She remembered Mary's scars, Josephine's tears, Ruth's limp, her own fear of the master's hand. And in that moment, Clara felt something shift. The supper table would no longer be a place of display for the Jamesons. It would become something else entirely. The guests arrived, The candles flickered, the silver gleamed. The family sat, the overseer joined. Laughter filled the room. Clara moved behind them, silent, graceful, unseen yet present in every detail. The food was served, the wine poured, the evening unfolded as it always did. No one noticed her hand linger just a little longer over a dish. No one noticed the faintest shake in her breath as she placed it on the table. And so it began quietly, invisibly, with the touch of a hand and the slip of a powder. The supper of the Jameson plantation, meant to be another show of power and refinement, would instead become the stage for something far darker. The night of the supper began like so many others, but the air felt heavier to Clara. The dining room glowed in candlelight, its tall ceilings catching shadows that swayed with the flames. The Jamesons had dressed in their finest, as they always did when neighbors or business partners were invited. Elizabeth Jameson wore a gown of pale blue silk, her neck heavy with pearls. Colonel Jameson carried himself with the pride of a man who believed every guest admired him. The children sat quietly at the far end of the table, rehearsed in the manners drilled into them by their mother's stern hand. The guests were men of wealth, and wives who nodded politely at every word their husbands spoke. They laughed at the colonel's stories, praised the food, and commented on the fine polish of the silver. To them, it was all a performance of Southern grace. But Clara, moving silently with the other servants, saw something else. She saw the way the colonel's smile never touched his eyes, the way the mistress gripped her wine-glass as if it were the only thing she controlled, the way every guest carried pride like a weapon. Clara's heart beat with a steady rhythm, as if matching the ticking of the tall clock in the corner. She had measured her steps carefully, her plan hidden behind each movement. The powder she had gathered, ground into a fine dust, had already found its way into the food. It was a bitter herb, one known in whispers among the enslaved. Taken in small amounts, it caused stomach pain and weakness. Taken in greater measure, it brought death. Clara had chosen her amounts carefully. She did not want an immediate end. She wanted them to feel the slow grip, to suffer as she had seen others suffer. As the dishes passed from hand to hand, Clara moved with practiced ease. Her face was calm, her eyes lowered. No one suspected. To them, she was invisible, as all servants were meant to be. That invisibility was her shield, and tonight it became her weapon. The first signs came quietly. One of the guests, a heavy man with a booming laugh, paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. He frowned, pressed a hand to his stomach, and forced a chuckle. "Perhaps I have eaten too much already," he said, though his face was pale. Another guest soon followed, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, his brow damp with sweat. The colonel himself lifted his glass, but his hand shook slightly before he set it down again. Elizabeth Jameson noticed, and her lips tightened. She prided herself on the perfection of her table. For her guests to grow ill during supper was an insult she could not bear. She glared at the servants, her eyes sharp as knives. Clara felt the gaze, but did not falter. She poured wine into another glass, her hand steady, her heart iron. Then came the moans. Soft at first, then louder, until the room was filled with the uneasy sound of men and women shifting in pain. Plates clattered as they were set down half-eaten. Chairs scraped against the floor. Elizabeth Jameson stood, her face white with fury and fear, demanding to know what was wrong. The colonel gripped the edge of the table, his pride fighting against the weakness that bent his body. Chaos spread. The guests rose unsteadily, some clutching their stomachs, others stumbling toward the door. The children began to cry, frightened by the sight of adults writhing in discomfort. Servants rushed to bring water, to fan the guests, to offer comfort where none could be found. In the midst of it all, Clara moved with the others, but inside her chest was a storm of triumph. dread, she had done this. She had struck a blow no whip could undo, no overseer could prevent. Through the long night, the plantation was filled with groans and cries. Some of the guests were carried out, too weak to stand. Others collapsed where they were, calling for doctors who were hours away. The colonel himself lay stretched across his bed, his breath ragged, his face twisted in pain. Elizabeth sat beside him, clutching his hand, her pearl necklace broken, beads scattered across the floor. Her anger now mixed with terror, for the household she ruled with such iron discipline had slipped beyond her control. In the quarters, the enslaved whispered. They had seen the guests carried out. They had heard the cries. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the food had spoiled. Others whispered of poison. And in those whispers, Clara's name was not spoken, but her face was remembered. She kept to herself that night, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. She felt the weight of what she had done pressing down on her, but beneath, it was a strange calm. For the first time in her life, she had turned fear into power. Morning brought no relief. The doctors who arrived could not agree on the cause. They spoke of bad meat, of fever, of ailments of the stomach. They bled some of the sick, gave powders to others, but their remedies brought little comfort. Several of the guests worsened, their bodies trembling with chills, their skin ashen. The colonel himself could not rise from his bed. Elizabeth's fury turned to desperation. She stormed into the kitchen, demanding answers, her voice sharp enough to cut. She accused the cooks of negligence, of carelessness, of poisoning her household through incompetence. Her eyes landed on Clara more than once, searching for some sign of guilt. But Clara's face remained still, her expression calm. The days dragged on, each one filled with tension. The plantation no longer echoed with the usual rhythms of work and command. Instead, it groaned under the weight of sickness and suspicion. The enslaved walked carefully, their voices low, their eyes darting toward the big house. They knew punishment could come at any moment. Accusations were dangerous, for the blame of the white household often fell on their shoulders, whether guilty or not. Clara carried the secret like a stone in her chest. She had dreamed of revenge, but the reality was heavier than she imagined. At night, she lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the sick drifting from the big house. She thought of her mother, of the life stolen from her, of the years spent in servitude. She thought of the children crying at the table, their faces pale with fear. She told herself they were not innocent, for they would grow to inherit the same cruelty. Yet a part of her heart ached, for children had no choice in the world they were born into. The sickness did not claim them all. Some recovered slowly, weak, and shaken but alive. Others lingered near death, their bodies too frail to fight. A few never rose again. Their funerals were somber affairs, spoken of in hushed tones in Natchez society. The Jameson name, once spoken with admiration, now carried a shadow. Guests whispered of the supper, of the mysterious illness, of the disgrace that clung to the family. Elizabeth, once so proud, could not bear the whispers. She turned her anger toward those she could still control, the enslaved. Punishments grew harsher. Whippings were ordered for the smallest mistakes. Food rations were cut. Elizabeth prowled the halls like a restless ghost, her eyes always searching, her hands always trembling. She was convinced someone had poisoned them, and her suspicion narrowed again and again on Clara, yet she had no proof. The thought of it tormented her, and the torment spilled onto all who lived under her command. Clara endured it with a quiet strength. She bore the punishments, the accusations, the weight of fear. But inside, she felt something shift. She had tasted power, and though it came with danger, it also gave her a strength she had never known. The world of the Jamesons was not unshakable. It could be broken, if only for a moment. She had seen their faces twisted in pain, their voices crying out in desperation. She had seen them stripped of their pride, and that memory gave her a kind of freedom no chain could fully bind. The story of the poisoned supper spread beyond the young. Plantation. In Natchez, it was whispered in parlors and on street corners. Some spoke of it as a cautionary tale, a warning of the dangers hidden in their own households. Others dismissed it as rumor, unwilling to believe such a thing could happen in their world of order and control. But among the enslaved, the story took on another life. It became a spark of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest bondage, there were ways to strike back. Clara's name was not spoken openly, but in the quiet of the cabins, in the shadows of the fields, her act was remembered. And yet, the danger was not over. Suspicion still hung over her like a storm cloud, and storms in the South always broke with violence. Clara knew the Jamesons would not rest until they found someone to blame. The question was not if punishment would come, but when. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The plantation carried on, but its rhythm was broken. The colonel never regained his full strength, and his pride was scarred. Elizabeth grew more bitter, her beauty fading into hard lines and sharp words. The children clung to her, frightened by the sickness that had stolen their sense of safety. And through it all, Clara remained a silent figure moving through the house, carrying her secret with her, waiting for the reckoning she knew must come. Winter settled over Natchez with a chill that seeped into the bones. The great houses along the bluffs seemed colder than ever, their wide porches empty of laughter, their halls echoing with unease. On the Jameson plantation, the air had not returned to normal since the night of the poisoned supper. The sickness had left its scars, both on the bodies of those who survived and on the pride of the family. Colonel Jameson, once the picture of strength, moved more slowly now, his steps uneven, his voice weaker. He drank more brandy than before, as if trying to wash away the shame that clung to his name. Elizabeth Jameson grew thinner, her eyes sunken, her temper sharper. What had once been a household of rigid control was now a place of suspicion and fear. Clara felt it pressing down on her every day. She still rose before dawn, lit the fires, scrubbed the silver, carried the trays. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but inside the walls of the big house, the eyes of the mistress were always watching. Elizabeth no longer trusted the food she ate or the water she drank, unless she saw it prepared herself. She demanded to taste from each pot before it was carried to the table. She ordered the servants to eat scraps from the dishes before they were served, a cruel test that left many with empty stomachs and bitter humiliation. Clara endured it with the same steady face she had always worn. She knew suspicion was heavy upon her, even if no proof had been found. More than once, she caught Elizabeth's gaze fixed on her, sharp and piercing, as if she were trying to read Clara's very soul. But Clara gave nothing away. Her silence was her shield, her calmness her defense. The enslaved whispered among themselves in the quarters at night. Some admired Clara's courage, though they never spoke her name aloud. Others feared what might come if the truth was ever uncovered. Punishment for one could mean punishment for many. Stories of slaves hanged for far less traveled through the cabins like the cold wind itself. Clara heard these whispers, but she did not let them shake her resolve. She knew the risk she had taken. She knew the price could still come due. The Jamesons, desperate to reclaim their standing, began to look outward for answers. Colonel Jameson, though weakened, sent word to other planters, asking if they too had seen strange illnesses in their households. He hinted at spoiled goods brought by traders from New Orleans, at bad flour or tainted meats. Some neighbors offered sympathy. Others quietly mocked his misfortune. But no one spoke of poison openly. To admit such a thing was to admit weakness. to admit that one's own household was not secure. Elizabeth, however, was not content with whispers of spoiled goods. In her heart, she believed someone had done this deliberately. She turned to the overseer, Samuel Griggs, a hard man with a cruel streak. She gave him quiet orders to watch the slaves more closely, to listen for any sign of disloyalty. Griggs took to the task with eagerness. He prowled the quarters at night, questioned the men and women during their work, demanded confessions where none were given. His whip cracked more often, his punishments harsher. The enslaved bent lower under his gaze, but no one spoke. Clara felt the overseer's eyes on her, heavy and dangerous. He questioned her more than once, his voice low and threatening, asking if she had seen anything suspicious, if she knew who might have tampered with the food. Clara met his questions with calm replies, saying only what was safe. She would not betray herself, nor would she betray the silent trust of those who knew more than they dared speak. But each day grew harder. The burden of the secret weighed heavily, and the household grew more violent. Elizabeth's paranoia twisted her into something harsher than before. She struck the servants for the smallest missteps, screamed at them for imagined slights, demanded more obedience than ever. Her children shrank from her temper, their laughter replaced with silence. The house that had once been a symbol of power now felt like a cage trembling with fear. For Clara, the memory of that night remained vivid, the sight of proud men bent. In pain, the sound of Elizabeth's fury breaking into fear, the moment when power shifted, however briefly, into her hands. She carried that memory like a flame, hidden deep within her. It warmed her in the cold nights, reminded her that even in bondage, she had found a way to strike back. Yet she also carried the weight of the faces of the children, their small voices crying in confusion. She told herself again they were not innocent, for they were heirs to the cruelty of their parents. Still, their cries haunted her in the quiet hours. The weeks turned to months. Some of the sickness faded, but whispers lingered. Neighbors still spoke of the Jameson supper, though always in hushed tones. The family's social standing had slipped, and Elizabeth could not bear the insult. She withdrew from gatherings, refused invitations, and nursed her bitterness like a wound. Colonel Jameson drank more heavily, his health declining. The plantation itself suffered, the fields less productive, the overseer more brutal in his attempts to make up the difference. The enslaved bore the brunt of it all longer hours, harsher punishments, less food. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Clara stood outside the kitchen, the smell of smoke and bread in the air. She watched the sky turn red, the river glowing in the distance. For a moment, she let herself imagine a life beyond this place, a life where she could walk freely, where no one owned her name or her body. She thought of Natchez under the hill, of the chaos and freedom whispered about, of the riverboats that carried people northward. The dream was fragile, but it flickered in her heart. Her moment of thought was broken by the heavy steps of the overseer. Griggs came toward her, his face grim. "Mistress wants you," he said, his voice flat. Clara felt a chill, but she nodded and followed. Elizabeth Jameson waited in the parlor, the fire casting her face in sharp light. She sat stiffly, her hands clenched on her lap. Her eyes burned with suspicion. "Clara," she said, her voice low but sharp, "you were in the kitchen that night. You touched every dish that left this room. Do not think I have forgotten." Clara lowered her eyes, her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am. I served as I was told." Elizabeth leaned forward, her face inches from Clara's. Something was done. "To us. Do you understand? Someone sought to destroy my family. And if I find out it was you—" Her words trailed off into silence, but the threat hung heavy in the air. Clara stood still, her heart pounding, but her face calm. "I did only what I was told, ma'am." Elizabeth searched her eyes, desperate for some flicker of guilt. But Clara gave her none. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. At last Elizabeth waved her away, her lips pressed tight. Clara turned and walked out, her steps steady, though her legs trembled beneath her. The encounter left her shaken, but also certain. The mistress would never let the suspicion rest. The overseer's whip would grow heavier, the punishments harsher. The noose of suspicion was tightening around her, and sooner or later it would close Dot in the quarters. Clara lay awake that night, staring at the low ceiling. She thought of her mother, of the life stolen from her, of the chain of bondage that stretched from one generation to the next. She thought of the flame she had lit that night at the supper table, a flame that had scarred the Jamesons, but had not yet consumed them. She wondered if her time was running out, if her fate would be the gallows or the whip. Yet even in the shadow of fear, she felt no regret. She had struck a blow, and in that act she had claimed something that could never be taken back. The days to come would decide her fate, but for Clara, the path was already set. She had chosen defiance, and there was no turning back. Spring came to Natchez, with blossoms on the trees and green along the riverbanks, but the Jameson plantation did not bloom with the season. It remained a place of unease, wrapped in silence and suspicion. The poisoned supper had passed months before, yet its shadow never lifted. Colonel Jameson walked the halls as a diminished man, coughing often, his frame thinner. Elizabeth moved like a restless spirit, her fury and fear wrapped tightly around her. The children spoke little, their laughter stolen. Guests no longer gathered around their table. The mansion, once meant to be a beacon of wealth and order, stood like a monument to shame. For Clara, every day was another step along a narrowing path. She carried trays, scrubbed floors, sewed clothing, moved silently through the rooms she knew better than anyone. Yet always she felt the weight of eyes upon her. The mistress watched her at every turn. The overseer's questions never stopped. Even some of the enslaved, fearful of what her secret might bring upon them all, kept their distance. Clara's heart was strong, but it was weary. She lived with the knowledge that discovery meant death, and death on a plantation was never gentle. Breaking point came one hot afternoon when Elizabeth, her nerves frayed beyond reason, collapsed in a rage before her servants. She had been speaking of the supper again, her voice trembling with old fury. "Someone in this house poisoned us," she cried, her eyes wide and glassy. "And I will not rest until I know who." Her voice cracked, and she struck the table with her hand. A room fell silent, every servant frozen, waiting for the storm to pass. But this time, the storm did not pass. Elizabeth rose suddenly, pointing a shaking finger at Clara. "It was you," she said, her voice sharp as steel. "You have carried defiance in your eyes since the day you came here. You wanted revenge? You will not fool me any longer." The overseer seized Clara at once, his grip iron on her arms. The other servants lowered their eyes, powerless to intervene. Clara did not struggle. Her heart thundered, but her face remained calm. She had known this moment would come. She had prepared herself for it in the quiet of many nights, whispering prayers to a God she hoped still listened. They dragged her to the shed where punishments were dealt, and there the questioning began. Elizabeth demanded a confession. The overseer shouted, struck, threatened. Clara stood firm, her silence unbroken. Pain racked her body, but still she gave them nothing. She would not hand them the satisfaction of hearing her beg. She would not give them her fear. She had taken their power once, and she would hold on to that memory, even as they tried to crush her word spread quickly through the quarters. The enslaved gathered in silence, their faces grim, their hearts heavy. Some wept quietly for her. Others whispered that Clara had done what none had dared. Whether she confessed or not, they knew the truth. She had struck a blow against the masters, and, though it had cost her dearly, it had given them all a glimmer of something rare. Hope. The days of torment stretched on. Elizabeth grew more desperate, demanding that the colonel act. But Richard Jameson, weakened by sickness and whiskey, had little strength to command. He muttered of evidence, of needing certainty, but his voice carried no weight. Elizabeth wanted blood. She wanted the fear lifted from her house, even if it meant spilling the life of one young woman. Finally, the overseer carried Clara to the county jail in Natchez, where the law would take hold. The town was no stranger to such accusations. White planters feared poison more than they feared rebellion. It was a weapon invisible, a weapon that struck from within their very homes. Trials for enslaved people accused of such acts were swift and cruel, meant less for justice than for warning. Clara stood before the court, her wrists bound, her face bruised but proud. The accusations were laid out plainly. She had poisoned. The Jameson household brought sickness and death to their table, conspired to destroy the family. Witnesses were called the overseer, who spoke of her silence. Elizabeth, who swore she had seen defiance in her eyes. Even some guests who recalled her serving them that night. No one spoke in her defense. In that room, her word carried no weight against the voices of the white elite dot, and yet, as the proceedings unfolded, Clara did not bow her head. She stood tall, her back straight, her eyes steady. The murmurs in the court grew as people noticed the calm of her bearing. Some whispered she looked like a queen in chains. Others spat that she was nothing but a criminal. But to those who watched closely, there was something unbroken in her gaze, something stronger than the walls around her. The verdict was never in doubt. Guilty, the judge declared. The punishment, death by hanging. It was to be carried out swiftly, as a warning to others. The sentence spread through Natchez like wildfire. Some planters spoke of relief, glad that order would be restored. Others whispered uneasily, for the thought of poison lingered in their minds. Among the enslaved, grief and pride mingled. They mourned for Clara, but they also held her act like a hidden torch, a reminder that even in bondage, resistance was possible. On the morning of her execution, Clara was led from her cell into the bright sunlight. The crowd had gathered planters, merchants, townsfolk, even children clutching their mothers' skirts. They came not only to see justice, but to reassure themselves that order remained. The gallows stood tall, its rope swaying gently in the wind. Clara walked steadily, her chains clinking with each step. She did not cry. She did not plead. She lifted her head and looked out over the crowd, her eyes sweeping over the faces that stared back at her. Some said later that in that moment, she smiled. The rope was placed around her neck. The preacher muttered prayers. The crowd hushed. Clara closed her eyes and thought of her mother's face, of the march that had brought her to this place, of the flame she had lit at the supper table. She thought of freedom, not the freedom of papers or promises, but the freedom of knowing. She had defied them, if only for a moment. When the trap gave way beneath her feet, she carried that freedom with her into the silence. The story of Clara did not end with her death. In Natchez, planters spoke of her as a warning. They told her tale to frighten others, to remind their households of the cost of defiance. But among the enslaved, her name lived in whispers of reverence. They told her story by the fire, in the fields, in the quiet of night. They told of the woman who poisoned a plantation household, who stood unbroken before her masters, who walked to the gallows with her head held high. For years after, whenever sickness struck a white household, her memory returned. Whenever a slave carried food to a master's table, the unspoken fear lingered. Clara had shown them that power could be touched, that even in chains, one could strike at the heart of the oppressor. Natchez itself would change. The war would come, the plantations would fall, the grand houses would stand as monuments to a vanished world. But Clara's story remained, carried not in books or monuments, but in the hearts of those who remembered. Her act of defiance was dangerous, tragic, and costly. Yet it was also a spark, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, courage could rise from the most unexpected of places. Today, her name does not appear in the ledgers of the rich or in the polished histories written by the victors, but in the quiet telling of her story, she lives on as a symbol of resistance, of strength, of a spirit that no chain could fully bind. Clara of Natchez, the enslaved woman who poisoned a plantation household, belongs not to the Jamesons who sought to erase her, but to the memory of those who knew what it meant to be bound and yet unbroken. And so the story closes not with the triumph of the powerful, but with the quiet, enduring echo of a woman's defiance. Clara's supper still lingers in history, not as a meal of Southern grace, but as a moment when the oppressed seized power, if only for a fleeting night. It is a story that unsettles, that haunts, that reminds us of the hidden struggles behind the polished facades of the Old South. It is a story worth remembering because it speaks to the courage of the forgotten and to the cost of freedom.